Life as a Spartan was anything but gentle. From the moment a boy entered the world, his fate was no longer his own. In Sparta, individuals didn't live for themselves, they lived for the state. A Spartan male was viewed less as a child and more as a future weapon shaped for one purpose: war. Every breath he took was meant to serve the survival and dominance of Sparta. When he wasn't fighting, he was preparing to fight. There was no escape from this destiny. Today, we're going to explore what everyday life was really like for the average Spartan warrior. And before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to Zeus History, or drop a comment telling us which strange or brutal society we should break down next. Welcome to Sparta. A Spartan boy's life was judged almost immediately after birth. Shortly after a woman gave birth, the newborn male was brought before the Gerousia, a council of elderly Spartan elites. These men examined the infant carefully, not with compassion, but with cold practicality. Strength meant survival. Weakness meant death. If the baby appeared frail, deformed, or unlikely to grow into a capable soldier, he was deemed a liability to the state. Contrary to popular legend, these unwanted infants were rarely thrown from cliffs. More often, they were abandoned in remote areas beyond the city, left to the mercy of nature. On rare occasions, locals might rescue and raise them in secret, but most perished from exposure. Those who passed the Gerousia's inspection were returned to their families, already marked as property of Sparta. From early childhood, these boys were hardened both physically and mentally. Comfort was discouraged. Obedience was enforced. By the age of 7, the state officially took control, removing boys from their homes and placing them into the agog, a brutal training system designed to break individuality and forge discipline. Hunger, pain, and fear were tools of education. Survival wasn't guaranteed, but excellence was demanded. In Sparta, to live was to serve, and to serve was to fight. A Spartan's life was not measured by happiness or freedom, but by how well he fulfilled his role on the battlefield. Spartan baby boys weren't raised with tenderness or comfort. From the very beginning, hardship was part of their upbringing. Instead of being washed in warm water, newborn boys were reportedly bathed in wine. Spartans believed wine revealed weakness. If a child was frail or unhealthy, the shock could trigger seizures or even death. In their eyes, this wasn't cruelty, but a test of fitness. These children were also trained early to fear nothing. Darkness, silence, and isolation were intentionally introduced into their lives. Crying was discouraged, and when a child wailed or complained, parents and caretakers simply ignored it. Pain was meant to be endured, not soothed. This harsh conditioning continued until the age of 7. As brutal as those early years were, they were considered the easiest phase of a Spartan boy's life. Everything changed once he turned 7. At that point, the state officially took ownership of the child. Family bonds became secondary and survival became a public responsibility. This was the age when true military discipline began. At 7 years old, a boy was enrolled into the Aguja, Sparta's infamous training system. Oversight of this process fell under the authority of the nomos, a state official often described as a boy herder. His role was to supervise, discipline, and harden the next generation of Spartan warriors. The agoge itself was divided into stages based on age. The paids consisted of boys between 7 and 17, the paidiskoi covered youths from 17 to 19, and the habantes included young men from 20 to 29. Some historical sources suggest further yearly subdivisions within these groups, creating constant competition and hierarchy. During the early stages of the agoge, Spartan boys were subjected to relentless physical and mental training. Over nearly a decade, they were molded into disciplined, fearless soldiers. They learned hand-to-hand combat, battlefield tactics, endurance under pain, and survival skills such as hunting and living off the land. Mercy was not taught. Strength, obedience, and loyalty to Sparta were all that mattered. Spartan girls were not placed into the same brutal system as boys, but that didn't mean their upbringing was easy. From an early age, they were trained with a specific goal in mind: to become strong, healthy women capable of producing strong, healthy warriors. In Sparta, motherhood was considered a civic duty. The future of the state depended on it. No pressure at all. Rather than being confined to the home, Spartan girls participated in physical training. They were taught dance, gymnastics, and athletic competition. Activities like javelin throwing and running were encouraged to build strength, endurance, and coordination. The belief was simple: only a powerful woman could give birth to powerful sons. Because of this role, Spartan women enjoyed an unusual level of freedom compared to the rest of the Greek world. To outsiders, they seemed shocking. Other Greeks often described Spartan women as outspoken, dominant, and even immoral. They moved freely in public, managed estates, and were known for speaking their minds, even to men. Legally, Spartan women had rights few other Greek women possessed. They could own land, inherit property, and control wealth in their own name. Many were also better educated than women elsewhere in Greece. While men trained for war, women effectively ran Spartan households and managed much of the city's economy. Although Sparta is infamous for practicing infanticide on newborns deemed weak or unhealthy, it remains unclear whether this policy applied equally to girls. Ancient writer Plutarch suggests it may not have. Unlike boys, girls were not handed over to the state. Instead, they were returned to their mothers shortly after birth. From there, Spartan girls were raised with a structured lifestyle focused on physical fitness and nutrition. Exercise was not optional. Their training aimed to make them nearly as strong as their male counterparts, though without combat instruction. They learned how to ride horses, run long distances, wrestle, throw the discus and javelin, and compete in strength trials. The goal was not warfare, but resilience, a body capable of enduring childbirth and sustaining the future of Sparta. When you break it down, Spartan attitudes toward discipline start to make sense. Excess had no place in a society built entirely around warfare. Heavy drinking was seen as a direct threat to a soldier's effectiveness. A drunk warrior couldn't fight, couldn't think clearly, and couldn't protect the state. To Spartans, that made intoxication a form of weakness. From an early age, Spartan children were taught that losing control was shameful. Excessive drinking was associated with slaves, not citizens. On occasion, Spartan masters would deliberately force their enslaved people to drink until they became loud, unstable, and aggressive. Once completely intoxicated, these slaves were publicly displayed before local children as living warnings. This is what a lack of discipline looks like. That didn't mean alcohol was completely forbidden. Wine was permitted in moderation, usually diluted and consumed with meals. But surviving as a Spartan required constant physical readiness and mental control. Those who indulged too much simply didn't last long in battle. Weakness, in any form, was quickly eliminated by reality. Discipline extended beyond behavior and into appearance. From the age of 7, Spartan boys were closely monitored in how they dressed. Each child was issued a single garment per year, a simple cloak, traditionally red. No replacements, no extra layers. This wasn't just about uniformity. Limiting clothing discouraged comfort and excess. If a boy gained too much weight and could no longer fit properly into his cloak, there were only two solutions: eat less or train harder. The garment did not adjust to the body was expected to adjust to the garment. Footwear was another luxury denied. Spartan boys went barefoot year-round, forced to toughen their feet and adapt to the terrain. Shoes were only granted once a young man completed his training and entered full military service. Until then, discomfort was part of daily life. Another lesson in endurance, obedience, and survival. Spartan boys were expected to endure discomfort as a normal part of life. From childhood, they were forced to go barefoot year-round, even in winter, even through snow. The purpose was simple: toughen the soles of their feet until thick calluses formed, allowing them to march long distances across any terrain without hesitation or pain. Hunger was another constant companion. In the communal mess halls, boys were deliberately given portions that were never quite enough. The goal was to keep them lean, athletic, and permanently alert. A full stomach bred laziness. A hungry body stayed sharp. Gaining excess weight was dangerous. Fat boys were mocked, ostracized, and risked being expelled from the system entirely. Despite the rigid structure of Spartan life, marriage was encouraged. In fact, Spartans married frequently. Maintaining a steady birth rate was a strategic necessity. The army required a constant supply of new boys to train for war. Producing future soldiers was a duty to the state. That said, marriage did not mean domestic life. Spartan men were still required to live in military barracks, fully devoted to their service. Only after the age of 30 were they permitted to live outside the barracks. Men who married young were forced to visit their wives in secret, slipping away at night to spend brief moments together. If a man was caught sneaking out, punishment followed swiftly. He was beaten, not for leaving, but for being careless enough to get caught. In Sparta, punishment was rarely meant to discourage behavior. Instead, it reinforced the idea that failure came not from breaking rules, but from doing so incompetently. In many ways, the Spartans were unlike any other Greek society. Unlike Athens, where citizens pursued philosophy, art, and debate, Sparta rejected intellectual luxury. Their culture focused on a single objective: forging the most effective warriors possible. Everything else was considered a distraction. That being said, Sparta did educate its people, just not in the way most societies would recognize. Education in Sparta revolved almost entirely around warfare. Learning focused on tactics, discipline, physical conditioning, and mental resilience. Knowledge that didn't serve combat was considered unnecessary. This system wasn't limited to boys alone. Spartan girls also received a form of martial education. While they weren't required to serve as soldiers, they were trained to think, move, and endure like warriors. Strength of body and mind was expected from every citizen, regardless of gender. Violence was a constant presence in the upbringing of Spartan boys. Beatings and hazing were routine and often random. The purpose wasn't punishment, it was conditioning. Boys were kept in a permanent state of alertness, taught to expect hardship at any moment. Military instructors would sometimes deliberately provoke conflicts between boys, encouraging fights to erupt. These clashes weren't accidents, they were tests designed to expose weakness and identify dominance. Once a child was marked as weak, life became far more brutal. Weakness invited ridicule, isolation, and further violence. Compassion had no place in a system that valued survival above all else. Food deprivation was another calculated tactic. Spartan boys were intentionally given insufficient rations, forcing them to steal in order to survive. Theft itself wasn't the crime. Getting caught was. If a boy was punished, it wasn't for stealing food, but for lacking the intelligence or skill to do it successfully. Hunger sharpened their instincts, hardened their bodies, and ensured they grew into lean, resilient fighters rather than soft, complacent ones. Constant hunger also trained them to fight effectively even when starving, a crucial advantage in prolonged campaigns. Despite the emphasis on unity and service, Spartan society was far from equal. Strict social classes defined daily life. At the top were the Spartiates, full citizens and professional warriors. Beneath them were the perioikoi, free non-citizens who handled trade, craftsmanship, and commerce. At the bottom were the helots, a subjugated population bound to the land and forced to support the Spartan military machine. Together, these classes kept Sparta functioning, each serving a role that sustained the state's singular obsession with war. At the top of Spartan society stood the Spartiates. These were native-born Spartans, full citizens who traced their lineage back to the earliest founders of the city. They alone possessed complete political and legal rights. Only Spartiates could vote, hold office, and shape the laws of the state. They weren't just soldiers, they were the ruling class. They fought in the army, commanded it, and ultimately controlled every major decision in Sparta. In every meaningful sense, the Spartiates ran the system. Beneath them were the perioikoi, whose name roughly translates to those who live around. These people were not native Spartans and were often descendants of conquered or neighboring communities. They formed the economic backbone of the state. Perioikoi worked as craftsmen, blacksmiths, merchants, and traders, producing weapons, armor, and tools that kept the Spartan war machine functioning. They paid taxes, owned land, and enjoyed certain legal protections. Unlike helots, they were free and many were educated, able to read and write. While perioikoi did serve in the military when required, they were not elite warriors. Their primary role was logistical, maintaining trade routes, managing communication with neighboring regions, and supplying resources. Compared to other lower classes in ancient societies, life for the perioikoi was relatively stable and secure. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were the helots. They were an enslaved population forced to work the land and perform the most grueling labor. Farming, hauling, and domestic service all fell on their shoulders. The Spartans viewed the helots not just as inferior, but as a constant threat. Fear and hatred defined the relationship. Most helots originated from regions conquered by Sparta, particularly the fertile lands to the south. As Sparta's population grew, it expanded aggressively. Entire communities were defeated, their people stripped of freedom and bound to Spartan estates. These conquered populations became helots, forced to sustain the very society that had destroyed their independence. Their labor fed the army, supported the citizens, and allowed the Spartiates to focus exclusively on war. Over time, the helots became little more than property of the Spartan state. Technically, some helots could earn their freedom by serving in the military. In practice, that freedom meant very little. Even freed helots were never treated as equals. They remained outsiders, viewed with suspicion and contempt, barely considered human by Spartan society. In fact, Spartan law allowed helots to be killed under certain circumstances, even those who were no longer enslaved. This wasn't random violence, it was institutionalized terror. Periodically, the state sanctioned the killing of helots as a way to control their population and suppress rebellion. No helot was ever truly safe. Fear was built into the system. Because the helots handled most domestic labor and agricultural work, Spartan women were freed from many of the household responsibilities common elsewhere in Greece. If a woman wasn't raising children, she was expected to remain physically active. Spartan women participated in public competitions that tested singing, dancing, wrestling, throwing, and athletic performance. Artistic depictions and historical accounts suggest that these competitions were often performed nude. Physical confidence and strength were celebrated, not hidden. One of the most notable events was the Gymnopedia, an annual festival where unclothed youths displayed their athleticism and martial skill through choreographed war dances. The The festival is believed to have been introduced in 668 BCE, alongside the broader acceptance of athletic nudity in Spartan culture. While these competitions naturally attracted male attention and played a role in courtship, they served a deeper purpose. Physical training prepared women for the demands of childbirth and reinforced the Spartan belief that strong bodies produced strong warriors. In Sparta, even leisure was a form of preparation. So the question remains, could you live like a Spartan? In a world without comfort, mercy, or personal freedom, where your value was measured only by strength and usefulness to the state? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if this glimpse into Sparta intrigued you, be sure to check out our other deep dives into the strangest and most extreme societies in history.